Baseball Book Club. I'm Jim Walker, author of Crack of the Bat, A History of Baseball on the Radio. My guest today is Andy McCue. His previous book, Mover and Shaker, Walter O'Malley, The Dodgers, and Baseball's Westward Expansion, was the winner of the 2015 Seymour Medal for the best book of baseball history or biography. Today we'll discuss his latest view on the baseball expansion era, Stumbling Around the Bases, the American League's Mismanagement in the Expansion Eras, published by the University of Nebraska Press. Andy, great to chat with you about baseball anytime, but particularly on this topic, one of the most fascinating periods in the history of baseball, and you certainly are the expert on expansion. Is that what got you interested in writing about the American League's approach to the expansion during this period, your work with the National League in particular?
Yeah, it really was, Jim. When I was writing the O'Malley book and came to the section on the expansion in 61, 62, and looking at it, I have spent most of my life as a business journalist. And so I kind of look at the business aspects of things. And as I look at that expansion in terms of markets and of organization or that, the National League is just beating the heck out of the American League in terms of getting what it wants. And so that kind of was bubbling there in my brain when I read Rob Garrett's excellent book about the Giants in San Francisco and realized how much the American League allowing Charlie Finley to move to Oakland had really upset things there. I mean, the Bay Area was simply not big enough for two teams at that point. And then, of course, that leads to the fact that when they allow Finley to move, they're getting sued by Kansas City. They have to do something about that. So they force an expansion in 1969, which the National League doesn't want. In the course of that expansion, they create the Seattle Pilots, who are a disaster off the field, as big as they were on the field, as portrayed in Ball 4.
And a great ballpark, too.
Oh, yeah. And it was just part of a whole pattern of poor decision-making. And then in Seattle, of course, they go into bankruptcy and they get sued by Seattle. So it was just this pattern that kind of stuck in my mind, and that coalesced into a story that I could tell, basically.
I guess bad business decisions make more interesting things to write about than good business decisions.
Yes, often.
It was entertaining, and when I was reading your book, amazing stuff. I know the American League made a lot of mistakes during this time period, and you outline many of them in your book. Well, what do you think was the greatest mistake they made strategically? Too many to choose from.
I think it's not so much a mistake, but it was the basic structure of the whole thing. That it's a cartel. We all know it's a cartel, and that means that there is no real leader. They have to make decisions collectively, and there's not necessarily then anybody to follow through on those decisions. By definition, there's no leader. There's nobody there to set an agenda. There's nobody there to say, okay, where are we now? Where do we want to go? How do we get there? And those are all decisions which are very difficult to make collectively. And the structure forced them to make them collectively. But I guess if you want one thing, I would say, their biggest mistake was dawdling from the end of World War II until 1958 about doing anything about the demographic change and especially the West Coast markets. And so they allowed the National League basically to just steal that market. And a lot of what is the background in this book is the American League trying various measures, many of them poorly, to catch up with the West Coast preeminence of the National League. and something that they really wouldn't do for 30 years. So it's structural in a lot of ways, and they were very, very tentative all through the 40s and 50s, as the National League was to a great extent. And it really took O'Malley and Stoneham to say, okay, we're going to take that risk. And it was a risk to move out to the West Coast.
Yeah, it's interesting how history plays out to today. We're still seeing that conflict over the San Francisco market, and the fact that the A's are considering moving because they've been struggling for a long, long time, and they've always been the second-class citizen, and that really got established as an outgrowth of this period. So it's amazing how history continues to play out 50 years later.
It is one of the more interesting statistics I developed in the course of doing the book was in the first 10 years the Giants were in San Francisco, they averaged 1.5 million in attendance every year over that time. The A's moved in the 11th year, and for the second 10 years of Major League Baseball in the Bay Area, the two teams together averaged 1.7 million people.
Wow.
So that's just, the market was not there, but they were so desperate to get it. They had turned down Finley when he wanted to move to Louisville. They had headed him off when he wanted to move to Dallas, which would have been an excellent move, maybe, at least for the league. But they let him go to Oakland. Well, one, they were just sick and tired of arguing with Finley, I think. But at the same time, they wanted more of that West Coast market. And they moved into a market where it just wasn't there.
Okay. As I say, there's a lot in the book about what they got wrong, and more of it's going to come up, I'm sure, in our conversation. But let's turn it around. Did they do anything right? Were there any good strategic choices they made?
At that point in this period, that's a good. You're challenging me now. I was in such a negative mindset as I did the book. I think they did when they expanded in '69, they did what they should have done in Kansas City. Whereas in Seattle, they made a mess. In Kansas City, they solicited 4 or 5, interested groups. They worked their way through them about their finances and their ability to manage a team. And they chose Ewing Kauffman and chose well. And Kansas City was a very solid franchise. It still deals with the fact that it's a small market, but it's been pretty well run all those years. So I think that was a success. And eventually, of course, they worked themselves out of it in the late '70s and into the '80s, in large part, I just like saying because of George Steinbrenner. But and also I think because they got a good league president finally in Lee McPhail. But and I should say it's not like the National League was a paragon of decision making. They were just better than the American League. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on both in baseball and in the national picture that it makes that era extremely interesting, at least to me.
Yeah, it is interesting. There is a difference in the National League and the American League, even though they both are living under the same sort of decentralized structure that you point out would really hurt the American League in their decision making. But the National League was at least a little bit better. They did move quicker. They seem to go into the better markets. Would that be the real key to their success, that they simply staked out the better territories quicker?
Yeah, I think, the big thing was grabbing Los Angeles and San Francisco before anybody else moved. But they were also, I think, more cautious. And they did have more leadership than the American League had, mostly because of Walter O'Malley. That, preeminently, baseball was his business. He wasn't out there making chewing gum or pizza or real estate development or stocks and bonds or whatever it might have been. He was in the baseball business, and he thought about that business all the time. John Fetzer, who personally had many of the same qualities I think that O'Malley did. Could have been a strong leader in the American League, but he's running, an empire of television stations. And that has to, take precedence in his life. That's his basic business. Whereas O'Malley was thinking baseball and seeing his business, comparing it to other businesses, seeing nationwide business trends. And then when you go into a meeting of the National League people, he is better prepared. He is persuasive, and he is asking those long-term questions. Where are we now? Where should we go? How do we get there? And he's able, more often than not, although not all the time, to persuade his fellow owners to go along. But he's the one who's prepared. There's a great anecdote of there's a National League owners meeting. They all sit down around the table, and a new issue hits the table. And Phil Wrigley supposedly turns to O'Malley and says, "Walter, what do I think about this?" I think they had a more focused leadership than the American League did, more thoughtful leadership, and that helped a great deal.
What's the old adage? Walter O'Malley sneezes and everybody in the National League gets a cold, or something like that. So
yeah, there was. he didn't win all the time by any means. We wouldn't have an amateur draft if Walter O'Malley had anything to say about it. But he was more persuasive than everybody else at that table anyway. And I think in general it helped.
Both American League and National League really took a long time to expand to the West Coast. The obvious benefits of those markets were pretty well established at least 10 or 15 years before that, certainly after the Second World War. Why did it take so long?
That's a question I pondered for a long time, especially when doing the O'Malley book. If you look at the sporting news beginning, as you say, right after World War II, there is 13 years of discussion. What do we do about this market? They all recognized it. But do we expand by 2 teams in each league? Do we expand by 4 teams in each league? Do we deal with this new Continental League that Branch Rickey is bringing forward? Do we make the Pacific Coast League a major league? There's a lot of these ideas that are thrown around, but nothing is done about them. If you read the LA papers in the mid-50s, there's all this talk about some of the weaker franchises, the Senators, the A's, somebody like that moving to Los Angeles, but it doesn't happen. And I think there's what shall I call it? There's really kind of a lack of vision about the whole thing. Even when the Dodgers do move, the rest of the the National League requires O'Malley to agree that if any of the other teams in the league get a smaller visitors gate share in Los Angeles than they did in Brooklyn in 1957, O'Malley would have to reimburse them for the difference.
Wow.
And in the wake of all of the attendance records the Dodgers have set over there, that seems ludicrous.
Yeah.
But at the time, those other owners were really afraid of that. They were, O'Malley was taking a chance. It's kind of hard to perceive these days, but O'Malley really was taking a chance.
And they didn't want to join him in taking the chance.
No. He was a very conservative businessman, and he just perceived that there was a market there that he could gain from, and he did. And I think also it was important. There was a point before World War II when one of the more adventurous American League owners was going to move to Los Angeles. And it was Don Barnes of the then St. Louis Browns, now the Orioles. And he spent a year working with the relatively small airline companies at the moment and the train companies, and worked out a schedule that he thought could work. He shared it with the other major American League owners, and they pretty much agreed with him. And so he goes to the winter meetings in early December and he is fully confident at that point that the other American League owners are going to agree and allow him to move to Los Angeles. But for a little relaxation the day before the meetings, he goes to a football game in Chicago. And in the end of the game, they announced that the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And he knows that there's not going to be any kind of franchise movement in the midst of a war. By the end of the war, he sold the team, and the idea just kind of sits there. People know about it, but nothing really happens. And when the Browns do move, they move to Baltimore.
Yeah.
And moving eastward rather than westward. I think there's a lack of business courage. Can I call it that? But a lack of willingness to take a risk.
And because they're a cartel and they have their antitrust exemption, there's really nothing to push them beyond what their own perceived benefits of change would be.
Exactly. And I think that raises a point, Jim, that I think is very important here. It's a cartel, and everybody knows that anything that they agree to as a group sets a precedent for themselves. So anytime they do anything that would restrict the behavior of one of their number, say Finley, for example, they know that could be used against them in the future when they want to do something. So they're very cautious about what limitations they place on each other.
Yeah, very good point. There are a lot of characters here that are interesting. So I
Yes.
know you can't necessarily sort through all of them, but could you kind of pick one that is the most interesting one to write about, and then the one that you think was the most influential in the American League during this period?
The one who's most interesting to write about is always Charlie Finley. It's just amazing the what shall I say? The ability to look reality in the face and say it ain't so. And you can call them alternative facts or you can call them lying, but that was Charlie. And so he's always, it's so easy to catch him in contradictions, and so it's fun to write about him. Everybody thought at the time that John Fetzer, the owner of the Tigers, was the most influential member, and certainly a lot of people looked up to him. A lot of people respected him, but I guess he just wasn't a real persuasive person. And at the same time, he wasn't, as I noted before, he's got other businesses to run, so he's not really focused all the time. One of the interesting things to me is that when Bud Selig finally gets into ownership in 1970 and starts going to the meetings, he always structures his plane flights to and from the meetings so he can sit with Fetzer and talk with him and draw down the wisdom as Selig saw it. So I think Fetzer's in it. There's a lot of there are wealthy playboys, there are rags to riches stories, there are some of these owners are built on some of the most iconic products that we have today. Stouffer's frozen lasagna. That's money that led him into the ownership councils. So there's a lot of interesting personalities and just a lot of interesting stories about these guys, how they got the money to own a team, and then how they managed it if they did while they were running it. I think over time, baseball fans very much tend to underestimate the influence of ownership on a team beyond is the owner providing the money so they can buy the stars so my team can win. But the owners do a lot of other things that help a franchise to win.
Create an organization that the best players want to come to, for one, and believe they're going to prosper both on the field and off the field. That's kind of important, and also feel welcomed in that organization.
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned Fetzer, and everybody knows Finley, but he certainly had a lot to do with changing the direction that baseball was taking with the television industry and with the television medium at the time. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, you're better qualified to talk about that than I am. I mean, you've written the book about that era, and I cribbed mercilessly from it.
Well, I just want to see if you got it right.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, they had their starts and stops. I mean, Fetzer came up with the idea that would eventually be Monday Night Football, but he didn't present it well. He didn't really prove it. I mean, Pete Rozelle was a lot smarter, I think, than Fetzer was about how he packaged it. I mean, he basically, Fetzer came up with the idea and a package and just kind of dropped it on the desk of the networks. Rozelle went out there. He staged some Monday night games. He showed the networks, in a stepstone process, how this could work, how the market was there, how it would give them a strong presence on a Monday night, which was not a big night for them. He really kind of built it up and sold it. Fetzer didn't do that, but on the same time, he took what was really a chaotic and unproductive national television picture, and brought at least some order to it. He got ABC to buy into a true national picture, and then it didn't work for ABC for a number of reasons. But then he got NBC to step in behind them, and NBC Game of the Week ran for what, 20 years after that, 30 years after that. But I mean, when he started on it, you had this hapless, quote unquote, national TV package, but it was so restricted by, you couldn't go into major league markets where there was a home game. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do that market, you couldn't do in a certain minor. There were all these restrictions on it. It was not truly a national package. And you had the Yankees having a deal with CBS, which nationally broadcast some of their games and locked out other things. You had the Phillies doing a small regional package. I mean, it was a mess all around. And Fetzer brought all that together and enabled them to create the Game of the Week. And he also recognized, and I think this is really important, as you well know, he recognized that what the networks wanted really was the All-Star Game and the World Series. That, broadcasting a game on a Saturday afternoon in the summer when people had 8 jillion things to do was not a huge draw. But the networks were willing to pay for that in order to get the All-Star Game and the World Series. So he made sure that was really an entire package that they were willing to buy.
Yeah, he certainly brought kicking and screaming baseball into the modern television era, and it was so clear that the NFL had scooped them on that. Direction. Yeah.
Yeah, the NFL handled that so much better.
Is there anything that, when you went into your research and you began doing it, you realized you were completely wrong in your assumption going into the research? Anything that really kind of surprised you coming out of the research that you were unexpected?
There were details, I think, that surprised me to the extent when I found them. There was that bit about the Bay Area attendance that really struck me. That I noticed that, I noticed what I thought was a pattern and looked into it, which proved to be even truer than I thought it was, by breaking down attendance by game, by league, and finding that I think it was 66, that the average National League game drew 47% more people than the average American League game.
Wow.
And that was just astounding to me, that number was so large. And then the American League not immediately, but in the next year, changed how they reported attendance. They began reporting tickets sold rather than turnstile count. And that really cut the difference. But then it built up again. And by the early 70s, the differential is like 43%. The National League had the star power at that point because of integration, basically. They had newer ballparks. They just produced a more exciting brand of baseball, and they had the bigger markets. They had consistently made better decisions about where to put their franchises. And so that created, this enormous an attendance difference that I hadn't really appreciated how big it was. And yet the market understood that. I mean, one of the interesting things is when expansion does happen in 69, which the National League did not want to do and felt they were forced into it. At the same time, they can price their two expansion franchises at twice the cost that the American League feels that it can charge. And that's just, that's the market telling the American League, hey, you're far behind.
Yeah. In reading your book, it seemed like the American League started to figure it out a bit and move in a more positive direction, perhaps in the mid-60s around there. Did the second, third phases of expansion work a little bit better than their stumbling through the first phase?
I think so. I would say the third phase, when they created the Mariners and the Blue Jays, that worked a little definitely better than 69 was really a hit in Kansas City and a disastrous miss in Seattle. And when they came back, they made two pretty solid choices for 1977 with the Blue Jays and the Mariners. And to me, a lot of that had to do with Lee MacPhail, whom they had made their president. And he, I think, for the first time in the history, the first time since Ban Johnson in the early years of the American League, he figured out a real role for a league president. Most of them had been, they wore a nice suit, they talked to the press, they ran the umpires, but they didn't try and take a leadership role. Now, admittedly, the role of the league president is very limited. The owners are going to make the decisions. At the same time, the league president can present them with information, can come up with ideas, can sell those ideas to the group as a whole. And I think MacPhail proved very good at that. All of a sudden, you can see this in the Bowie Kuhn papers at Cooperstown. All of a sudden, when there's an owners meeting, they have these reams of data about new markets. This is not just the population of the market. This is the spending power of the market. This is the stadium alternatives in the market. These are the business community leaders and the political leaders that you really have to deal with and that you have to understand. And so he's really acting as an extremely effective chief of staff, which that role had not been really absorbed beforehand. In addition, he had personal qualities. I can't find anybody who didn't like Lee MacPhail. I mean, he got along with Charlie Finley and Bowie Kuhn at the same time. And that's a pretty difficult thing.
Yeah.
So I think he really, with really good staff work, he really kind of channeled the decision-making process that the owners went through and allowed them to do a much better job than had been done previously.
Sounds like he belongs in the Human Relations Hall of Fame as well as the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yeah, he could. I mean, his book, My Nine Innings, is very interesting. And I think even though he's in the Hall of Fame, he's been kind of underappreciated in the wider baseball community.
Well, after you win your next Seymour medal for this book, just start collecting them all like Olympic gold medals. What's your next project? As an author myself, it's like people start asking that right away. And it's like, well, maybe I'll just retire. But do you have any other projects in mind that you think you might want to work on?
I had exactly the same reaction. You finished this book about a year ago, and I said, okay, I'm going to write some little biographies, profiles and things like that. But I'm not going to do another book. But now a year out, I'm starting to think, I could use a new good biography of Gene Autry.
Okay.
And I like it because so many of the sources would be local here in Southern California, rather than, this book literally took me all over the country to libraries and archives and things like that. And so I don't know. I'm toying with that idea, Jim. You can't hold me to it.
Yeah, well, that's actually one of the interesting characters that I learned more about reading the book. I mean, obviously, I knew a bit of his background, but you go into it in some detail. But there's definitely a fascinating. It's like what he's in like 4 different Hall of Fames or 5 different Hall of Fames.
Yeah,
I mean, and
it's
it's
amazing.
just
And
incredible.
one of the nice things, frankly, is there is a very good biography of his music career,
Hmm.
with a ton of detail and a real understanding that helped me of what a good businessman he was. That in controlling the income that was being generated by him as a singer and a movie star, he really, much more than other performers, he really controlled the money, and that allowed him to do what he did. This book that I'm talking about makes almost no mention of his career as a
Right,
baseball owner,
right, right.
and so I think there's some space there. But it's a great base, and I'm forgetting the name of the author, a woman professor, but I think. I'm sure she has material that she might be willing to share with me, and we could take it. I don't know. These are daydreams, Jim. You know, you
Yeah,
finish a
I don't
book.
know. I see some excitement for another project. You sound pretty enthusiastic. So
Yeah,
I can see this definitely happening in a not too distant future. I just want to thank you for joining us today on Pandemic Baseball Book Club. That's a mouthful, but I think I got it
yeah.
out there. And wish you the best of luck with the book. I certainly recommend it to anybody who's interested in baseball during this period of time. Not just the players on the field, but all the decisions that are really dictating what those players are going to be able to do. It's a fascinating period of time in baseball, one of true transition, and you do such a great job with in both of your books, and I really appreciate your doing that hard work for all of us.